genetically, dyslexia has been linked to at least 40 different genes, 40 plus genes at this point. And what we see clinically, we have a screening test that looks at four different really basic factors and then several different factors in terms of outcome performance. And we get multiple patterns with that. We get at least 15 clear different patterns, and about 7 of those account for 90+% of the people that we see with dyslexia. But it is a spectrum. It's not just a tight cluster. And so every person with dyslexia is completely unique.
Got me diagnosed when I was in 3rd grade, and it was the most relieving day of my life because I finally had like kind of a place to hang my hat and say, see, I told you I'm not lazy, definitely not stupid. I just learned differently, and like that's totally okay.
We dyslexics, we were often, just set up for failure because, we were given books and tasks that really are not appropriate for the level that we were at.
So how do you expect anyone to be open to learning when their entire relationship with reading, with learning, is physical pain?
Wish I had understood when I was younger that the fact that my brain worked differently than people meant that I would be good at things in ways that other kids were not going to be good at.
I just assumed I can't be dyslexic because letters don't jump up and down for me.
Dyslexia is not a disorder. It is not a disease.
Once you sort of own it and embrace it, then you can have the power to deal with it. It's sort of empowering and also enriching to the whole community.
To those who don't understand what dyslexia is, that it's not a negative, it's not a problem, it's like we keep saying, superpower.
Hey everyone, we are Sonia and Nick, and this is Dyslexia Journey. And today we are very excited to have the authors of the Dyslexic Advantage on our show. So Doctors Brock and Fernette Eide are leading experts in the field of dyslexia and co-founders of the nonprofit Dyslexic Advantage and the social purpose corporation neurolearning.com. They have served as consultants to the President's Council on Bioethics and as visiting lecturers at the Stanford Graduate School of Education. The first edition of their book, The Dyslexic Advantage, was an international bestseller. And for those of you who are watching the video, here's the book. Dr. Brock and Fernette Eide, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having us.
So we thought we'd start, and we may get into, some more details as we move along here, but we thought we'd start with sort of like a really big overview. So I'm wondering what your definition is of dyslexia, and then what is the dyslexic advantage?
So we usually think of dyslexia in a little bit different terms than for example, the IDA definition, which really has been focused in on the learning deficit. And we see dyslexia as a broad neurological difference in processing that includes both challenges and strengths. And the fundamental process that's involved, we think at this point, is a difference in acquiring automaticity, a difference in the ability to process repetitive patterns the same way every time, that leads to more reliance on conscious processing rather than automatization. For example, in areas like basic skills, doing your phonics, doing your math times tables, doing a lot of repetitive things that become automatic over time with practice. What we see on a research basis is that dyslexic people tend to be a little slower to acquire automaticity in those kind of skills. As a result, a lot of things that are done below the level of conscious processing in most people get pushed up into conscious strategic problem solving type modes. This has disadvantage for some kinds of tasks, like things that you're supposed to do the same way every time, do them very quickly, do them without thinking about them. It's disadvantageous to have to kind of think your way through that. But as a result of pushing all of that into conscious processing, and especially into using forms of memory that are based on experience, episodic memory or personal memory, there are secondary benefits in terms of creativity. And there's a deep research literature on creativity that shows that the more that you use this kind of personal memory, the more creative you become. And that's what we think is responsible in dyslexia for this dual nature that we see: challenges, with a flip side of strengths. And as some people have said, it's why for people with dyslexia, a lot of times it looks like easy things are hard and hard things are easy.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar.
Yeah. So I guess let's dive a little deeper into the dyslexic advantage. So your book is really nicely organized in the way that you've categorized the advantages of dyslexia into four categories, which you call the mind strengths. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, so it's an acronym, so it stands for material reasoning, interconnected reasoning, narrative reasoning, dynamic reasoning. And initially, when we discovered these, we were interested because, historically, and I'm a neurologist, historically, as you might know, Samuel Orton was a neurologist who first began a detailed characterization of dyslexia. And then over this past century, he actually looked at all kinds of cognitive differences. It was early at that time, but he was actually a very good clinical person in terms of looking at different types of, features, different strengths. He recognized certain superiorities that dyslexic students had compared to non-dyslexic students, for instance. And then over the century, it got really narrowed. It was, you were saying 1980s, is that right? 1980s, it really began focusing on phonological weaknesses. And so it's, there's a historical kind of change that comes with it. So we were very interested when we wanted to approach comprehensive testing of dyslexic children and adults to see what were these broader cognitive profiles. And with detailed surveying of our community of over 12,000 people, dyslexics and non-dyslexics, trying to identify the phenotype, we identified these kind of 4 mind strengths. You want to talk more a little bit about that, or?
Yeah, I mean, do you want us to just kind of list them quickly?
Yeah, I think it'd be really helpful to go through them and kind of talk about the features of each of them.
Okay, just very briefly, M strength stands for material reasoning, and it's basically reasoning about objects in the material universe. So shape, movement, just features in 3-dimensional space. I strength stands for interconnected reasoning, and that can be thought of generally as thinking about conceptual connections and relationships, but includes things like a preference for seeing big picture as opposed to fine details, so seeing forests instead of trees, and also seeing how things work together to form systems. N strength stands for narrative reasoning, and that's basically a preference for reasoning using stories, cases, examples, simulations in the mind of things happening as opposed to using abstractions, to using principles, definitions, formulas, or things like that. So playing things out in the mind. D strength is kind of an extension of N strength. So it's using mental simulations, but it's to make predictions about processes that exist in the real world. So in strength, you can simulate things that are real, things that are imaginative. D strength, you're really focusing that down and saying, if I simulate a process that takes place in the real world and I run that forward through time, either into the future or backwards into the past, what will things be like? What must things have been like if this process takes place over time? And so it's basically this kind of predictive ability.
Yeah, and so in your book, you also, you go into much more detail, of course, with examples and diving into each of these. And then, but you do discuss trade-offs, as you call them, with each kind too. I was wondering if perhaps you could just give one example of sort of like a way it might look where it's the advantage and then a trade-off.
Yeah, I think one of the, on the surveys that Fernette mentioned that we did with people, we showed that there was a direct inverse correlation between 3-dimensional spatial ability and also a tendency to feel like people had difficulty putting their ideas into words. So a tendency to mentally simulate space was kind of inversely correlated with a tendency to think and reason using words. And there was actually some really interesting research that looked at just a few cases, a family cluster, and then also Albert Einstein's brain in a vat at Princeton University, that showed that people that tended to have very strong spatial ability, in some cases also had a very different allocation of cortical space in parts of the brain to more visual and spatial areas, and those were directly kind of taken from language processing areas. So there are reasons to believe, both kind of structurally and also just in terms of empirical observation of people with spatial ability, that there is this kind of trade-off between spatial strengths and kind of linguistic fluency.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to be clear, the visual spatial reasoning, like we often have observed in dyslexic people, that when we say they have strong visual spatial reasoning, that is in the M category, the material reasoning, right?
Well, it can be used in any of the categories. For example, if you're replaying,
like visualization, for instance, as opposed to, right?
Yeah, well, it can be used to imagine a story. It can be used to
scenarios.
Yeah, to sort of simulate any kind of thing. We would say it's really part of the simulation system. We also talk in the book about not too completely clustering visual and spatial simulation, because there are a lot of people that simulate well spatially that don't visualize well. If you have both good visualization abilities in the sense of seeing clear pictures, plus spatial reasoning ability, then you can have very clear movies kind of playing out in your head. But there are a lot of spatial people that reason well spatially, that see in their mind kind of ghostly images or a sense of movement or where things
or
are at.
position.
Rather than clear pictures. So visual clarity, which is kind of something that takes place in the back of the brain, and the spatial matrix, which is more of a hippocampal, perihippocampal thing, kind of deep in the brain. Those are two things that can work together, but they can also work separately.
Yeah, and I would say that sometimes, when if there is a transit, it's not that you. I mean, as far as we know, that you're born with this outstanding strength. Sometimes there's this talent, and then a person who is building all the time as a kid, and then as a teen, and then as an adult, right? They develop their spatial imagery even more, and that might have been based on actually physical experiences. So it kind of merges, and then later on, those are the people who are running these experiments in their heads. So it might have started with a lot of physical materials and then translated into this kind of kinesthetic, memory and projection.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And a good distinction too.
Yeah.
Because I had been thinking of them as pretty interlinked. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to mention is that you also emphasize that none of this is binary. So there are spectrum, and you emphasize that it's multiple different spectrums. So there could be a dyslexic person who is very strong in material reasoning, but not as strong in narrative reasoning, for example.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're really not dealing with a condition at all that's produced by a single gene, like a sickle cell anemia or something like that. We're really talking about a syndrome with multiple different contributing factors to it. Genetically, dyslexia has been linked to at least 40 different genes, 40 plus genes at this point. And what we see clinically, we have a screening test that looks at 4 different really basic factors, and then several different factors in terms of outcome performance. And we get multiple patterns with that. We get at least 15 clear different patterns, and about 7 of those account for 90+% of the people that we see with dyslexia. But it is a spectrum. It's not just a tight cluster. And so every person with dyslexia is completely unique. And in the book we talk about a discussion that we had with a really brilliant guy named Manuel Casanova, who's boarded in 3 separate medical disciplines. Just a super brilliant guy, and he used the example of modularity of like taking electronic components and plugging them together with different ones, with like one of those electrical sets that you can get as a kid, and how different functions you can get when you plug a power source into multiple different kinds of electrical devices. And that's pretty much what we see with dyslexia. When we talk about dyslexia, we're really thinking about kind of that central power source, that central set of characteristics, but the manifestations can be really different depending on what you plug it in with in other parts of the brain.
Going back to the trade-offs just for a moment, I noticed something that made me curious about distinguishing dyslexia and ADHD specifically, more of a dyslexic brain versus an ADHD brain. And yeah, it was just simply when I was reading a couple of the trade-offs, it reminded, it was kind of like, I can't remember the exact example, but someone would be, let's say, writing an essay, and then the focus would stay in a way, that wasn't desired by the teacher. And so just kind of that sense of the focus or the way the reasoning takes going a certain direction or another, or perhaps getting sidetracked is how it would be looked at, right? So yeah, it made me curious about like whether someone like that would get diagnosed with ADHD. And then also, yeah, so it made me curious, I think more generally though, like, are there some like overlap? Is there some overlap here, or how do you see that?
Is there a lot of
There's
misdiagnosis out there? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a high degree of overlap. And in fact, in our new movie that got released this month, The Dyslexic Advantage, we actually talk about that with John Uri Laws, or Jack Laws, because early on he was seen as very distractible in the classroom, but actually he actually had a lot of sensory awareness. It's true, but once he went out in nature, it was an environmental. It actually was his strength. He would notice a lot of things, and he would also delve deeply. It wasn't this sort of clinical picture of just inattentiveness and flitting from topic to topic. In fact, he needed to get engrossed in particular things and ask questions and go more deeply. And so this trait of restless mind was really present as a kid, and at some component, it's, because now he leads these tours to the Sierra Nevada, and he notices things. He notices, bird noises. He notices, different patterns of aphids on plants and things like that are actually functional, that are really valuable. And and so some of that is definitely environment. Might his working memory have been weaker when he was a kid? Probably yes. Also for most people, because working memory does expand. And so there is a lot of understanding about attention and working memory. How much can you give to one person at a time, and have them take it all in and balance it? That can get misinterpreted many ways. And also, there's at some point where it becomes, significant, more like a disease, where it's really impacting in all aspects of learning, for instance. But the percentages are much smaller for those situations compared to a lot of, energetic young kids. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, just to add go into kind of the left brainy mode for a second. So the research studies show that about 40% of people with dyslexia also will qualify for a diagnosis of ADHD, so 25 to 40%, depending on the study. The flip side is also true. People who are initially identified with ADHD, about 40% of those also will qualify for a diagnosis of dyslexia. And it's important to recognize that with both conditions, you're dealing with spectra of cases. So within ADHD, there's a big difference between kids that, for example, are just slow processors, kids that sometimes they say have slow cognitive tempo, and kids that are like highly distractible, that have more of a peripheral environmental focus, and sort of less persistence with task, and also kids that are just hyperkinetic, that are always moving all the time. So there's different groups of kids. But one of the really central kind of cool things about both dyslexia and ADHD is that there's a big overlap of these kind of outwardly focused, highly creative people. And some of the same studies that have been done demonstrating a creativity advantage for dyslexia have also been done with ADHD, and we get the same results. And it's been really interesting over the last couple of years as artificial intelligence has developed. We see actually manifestations within AI systems that are reflections of this kind of spectrum activity in cognitive processing that we see in the human population. So, for example, you can control on your AI models, for example, something called the temperature of the model, which will control how closely related the answers that the model will consider, or if it will kind of broaden its considerations a little more distantly and make more distant connections. What we see in people are that a lot of people with ADHD, a lot of people with dyslexia are just processors with a higher cognitive temperature in that respect. They're making more distant connections. So if you're asking an AI model to give you an exact answer, to reproduce something, give you a definition, for example, if the temperature is high, it may give you a definition that's technically wrong, but maybe more interesting, a different example. So in cases where you want just a very tight example, what did this person say on page 355 of their book? If you have the temperature way up, the model may hallucinate and give you an answer that's not quite right. But if you're asking for a creative answer, you want, what are 5 possibilities for things I could do in this situation? You want that little higher temperature. You want that creativity. On the flip side, if you have a task that calls for creativity and the temperature is really low, you may not get a good range of answers. And, I think that what we're seeing over the last, 10, 15 years or so, are that people are starting to think of people with ADHD, of people with dyslexia, as being positive contributors in the sense that they bring that creative possibility, and they're starting to understand the tasks where those kinds of minds have advantages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to add a little riff, like a neuroscience riff on that, because Brock and I were just talking about default mode network the other day, and this, kind of daydreaming network. And it's a classic kind of thing. And initially it was called default mode network because when they would kind of put test subjects in the scanner, it was the resting state. It was no task that they were supposed to be focusing on. Default mode was like when people would be daydreaming about, what would they do? What was the day going to be like? Or, things like that weren't on task. They were off task. But since then, there's been an explosion of literature about the default mode network, this daydreaming network, and the source of creative ideas. And so, for instance, if you were to get somebody with asking them to repeat back verbatim a story, okay, that would be like Brock was saying in AI. It's exactly what we're asking for. You want word for word exactly what was said. That is the task network. If you wanted them to go on a creative riff and create a story, that's originating in the default mode network of the brain. And that's an area that actually has a lot of greater activity and synchronicity, especially in the right hemisphere. So this kind of expanded now. A lot of what we do is with both sides of the brain, but this area is really interesting because historically, a lot of right hemispheric contributions to things like, reading, understanding, and idea generation have been devalued over the years. It was as if it was like, oh, the left brain's where it's at. And, and now in books like The Master and His Emissary, we're realizing, whoa, who's the master, who's the emissary? There's a huge role for the importance of the right hemisphere in actually having this, integrated, holistic understanding of the world.
I think that's a perfect segue into let's talk a little bit more about what is happening in the brain with dyslexic people.
And what's identifiable, I think,
yeah.
too, right? Like, because I think we're talking so much about how there is the spectrum and it's, 40 different genes, but are there some commonalities we could say when we look at the brain, for example?
Yeah, I think earlier studies were so focused in on what the brain does during the task of reading, particularly in the language areas, that if you look back at some of the older literature on dyslexia, like what characterizes the dyslexic brain, you get a million studies that look at what's going on during word recognition tasks, for example, or decoding tasks. But when people step back and look more broadly at what dyslexic brains do when they, for example, listen to people saying words, or when they're engaged in other kinds of tasks that involve visual processing and things, um, you start to see that there are differences that go way outside of reading tasks, and that people with dyslexia, as Fernette said, tend to use areas that relate to the processing of experience and the processing of uh, kind of imaginative, creative topics, more for all sorts of things. And that's been kind of a theme that's been developing, and that's one of the things that we tried to bring out in the book, is that um, it's not just in reading tasks that people with dyslexia show different patterns of brain processing. It's with just pretty much anything that you can think of. They'll show broadly different ways of using their brain to go through tasks and to process tasks.
And I would say that the lack of understanding of that breadth, I think for, tutors, teachers, specialists who really see this broad array of learning differences, you can take advantage of them the more specifically you know. But if, for instance, it gets relegated to dyslexia is taken care of by the reading specialist, I mean, there's a lot of importance in remediating difficulty with decoding, for instance. But, there's so many people who will talk about, trouble with, trouble with foreign languages or trouble with mathematics. And it's just not on the little roadmap for phonological awareness. But these are patterns that have been documented by research as well as strategies to help. And I think that part of it, and just not recognizing how to use strengths to overcome areas of weakness, but also, how to let those strengths really carry through, into whatever careers they want to pursue, is a big miss when it comes to education.
Yeah, that's another interesting point to dive into a little bit more, is why is it, and you kind of answered this already, but if you want to talk a little bit more about why it's so important for dyslexic people to figure out what their strengths are, like sort of framed around the mind strengths, I think, but just in general, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think this is, I think, one of the areas that we're sort of most heavily focused on currently in our thinking, is how to begin applying an understanding of the different ways that your brain can process information, and that you can achieve certain kinds of tasks that are available to you, that you have a whole menu of different options to choose from in solving problems and performing different kinds of tasks, and that a greater understanding of your own strength and weakness profile will allow you to select the proper options from that task. So, for example, in the area of mathematics, obviously math breaks down into really rote aspects like calculation, and then more cognitive aspects like problem solving, um, and then higher mathematics with a very spatial characteristic to it, and understanding sort of where your strengths are in those areas can allow you to kind of break tasks down into component parts and focus on the things that you do well, and then use supports in areas where you don't. So, for example, we've been at this business now for long enough that we're starting to see, the adult lives of people that we saw as children a couple of decades ago, and so we have a number of people that we saw, way back in the day, that are now, engineers and computer scientists at top companies that were brought to us for being unable to pass their second or third grade math class, and they were being held back in math. Yet they were extremely good math reasoners and very poor calculators. And by breaking down the components of math into understandable bits and saying, yeah, we need a little bit of support for the calculation, but for the reasoning component of it, let them move ahead at their own pace. And suddenly, students that were failing were now accelerated. And it's really important for all of these things. Similarly with reading, the task of just getting the information off the page is very different than the task of processing information. You're talking a moment ago about how dyslexic people do things differently. There was a study recently that looked at college students with dyslexia and without dyslexia, actually at reading comprehension. And they actually found that in untimed situations, the dyslexic college students showed superiority in certain aspects of comprehension that related to being able to compare ideas with different ideas and understand the implications of things. And so again, understanding that when it comes to reading, you may have a special strength in terms of really understanding themes within a book, or understanding how that information relates to what you learned in another subject, and bringing those things together, where you also at the same time have weaknesses in a timed situation, sitting in a test room with 60 minutes to answer a whole bunch of questions on a red topic.
You might miss some words, you might misread them or whatever. These things happen, so you can have these kind of like paradoxical strengths and weaknesses in the same field of reading. I mean, just knowing the details is really important. And also, I want to make a plug too we do have a free mind strengths assessment, which generates a report. So Dyslexic Advantage helped fund that with our community, and so it's available for free at NeuroLearning.
Hearing about all this work you've done, and for so long now, we're really curious, actually. How did you come to be interested in dyslexia specifically?
We had kids.
Okay. Yeah. So it was okay. In the family.
Yeah. So we were both working academic jobs. This is back in the 1990s now, the last millennium. And when we had our first child, we expected that like us, he would just take to school without a problem. And so we took him first to preschool. That was sort of a little more academic type of preschool, and he ended up failing all the really difficult subjects like walking in line, or sitting on the line, or not covering your ears during music time. And so we started realizing that he was put together a little bit differently than either of us, and it was really that investigation. And then when we had our second child, and she showed pretty classic dyslexic type issues, that we started realizing that we probably needed to learn a little bit more about these things. We were both in areas of medicine that weren't directly related to learning at that time, and we went into the literature, and we found that there was a huge amount of information that was really relevant and really helpful in understanding our own kids, but that this information wasn't really penetrating the clinical discipline of dyslexia support or learning support more broadly at that time. So there was a huge emphasis for kids that were struggling to focus at that time on medicating them, and it's still in place. The things that they were doing at that time for kids with behavioral issues were really, in our minds, just barbaric. We were seeing kids on 4 and 5 medications that looked like little zombies that could hardly walk, and
had the shakes when they write. It was like sad.
Yeah, it was really.
And that seemed to peak, and then it's improved. But you'll still see.
Yeah.
Some people who are.
Things have definitely gotten better, but all of these things just led us to want to get more involved in the learning situation. So about 25 years ago, that was really how we got involved in this field. And it was kind of a forward and backward period of discovery. We learned more and more about what was going on with our kids and also about our clinical cases. But it also became really apparent to me that as we learned more and more about this, that my father was dyslexic as well. We always had sort of laughed about the discrepancy in his grades. He was a straight A student in his accounting classes at university, and a straight D student in just about everything else. And
you're terrible. You still tease him.
Well, he always thought it was just simply on the basis, or he tried to pass it off as a basis of interest. But when we got into it further and started just doing some kind of rough evaluations of him, it was clear he just he had really significant issues with reading, and that recognition that there were people all around that had these learning differences that weren't being respected, I think, and recognized was a big insight to us. And he also just classically showed some of the cognitive strengths of dyslexia as well. And I think that was why we were so, I think,
amazed. But I mean, it was amazing.
I think we were prepared from the start to recognize that people combined these great strengths with these great challenges, and understanding why that was, how they could be connected, that it wasn't just you could have strengths in spite of the challenges. It wasn't just, Lance Armstrong, you can have cancer and then you can win the Tour de France, whether you dope or not, that's still a pretty good thing. Or Franklin Roosevelt, you can be in the wheelchair and be the president. It wasn't that kind of thing. It was these things are connected because we see these things over and over and over again in a way that just can't be explained by compensation or by random chance.
And I would add on to that the shortcomings of it was only when I had this different role of mother and not just physician that I could see the shortcomings of medicine, because if the kids looked kind of okay when they came in, they supposedly had school difficulties, but didn't look so bad when you tested them. And so it didn't seem, it's clear. So if a child is seizing, that's a medical emergency. But yet this thing that really is going to impact their whole life, as a parent, you think this is a problem. And from the medical point of view, it just didn't seem like it was that bad. And when I had the second role also, suddenly I also had to help with homework and stuff like that. And you're not thinking about that when you put your medical hat on. That's not your domain. That's education. But then you realize that if, to understand a lot of the neuroscience, now I realize that there's some super teachers and learning specialists who actually do that extra training and try to really work deeply with their students. But it's kind of too much because they're working about classroom management and things like that. And that's the thing, is that it seemed like if you, because I was familiar with adults who had to rehab and the neuropsychological implications, and this little piecemeal literature that wasn't using what you knew about the brain, because it's often parallel systems. It's not like, oh, bing, rote memories, for math facts is gone. There's nothing else you can do. I mean, that's not how the brain's wired. There's you've got two hemispheres. You don't have one. There's a lot of different ways that you can strategize, and that wasn't pieced together. I think in the last decade or two, there've been definitely more efforts to try to reconcile neuroscience in a practical manner to help with things like learning, so that it helps a child their whole life long. But that wasn't really how things were organized then. It was just like, well, if this is an attention problem, categories of kids who go on this medication may help them perform better on this clinical test. That's what it was. It wasn't really because education had nothing to do with medicine at the time. So, but even now, you'll get into these different schools, and it's a little bit of the problem when there's so much information. You don't get people who try to integrate the threads.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely true in our experience that most physicians won't even try to diagnose dyslexia or identify dyslexia, right? You get referred out to a neuropsychologist or somebody like that.
That's right. Well, that's why, Brock, for the most part, I hoped a little, but for the most part, developed this, this pretty extensive dyslexia screener, which is meant to be much more affordable and has helped, kids, but also adults, right? Do you want to mention that? I think it's pretty cool.
You know, when we started, when the first book came out, we were contacted by a rather wealthy, eccentric, dyslexic person who wanted us to put on a conference about dyslexia and dyslexic advantages. And it turned out he really wanted us to put on a conference about what a great guy he was. So that didn't exactly work out, but in the process of doing that, we were sort of found by a nonprofit foundation that then set us up as a nonprofit organization and helped to expand our work. We held a number of conferences on dyslexia and talent, and Fernette began writing the Dyslexic Advantage newsletter and magazine. And one of the things that also came out of the formation of that nonprofit was recognition of the fact that one of the big challenges for the dyslexic community is that at least 3/4 of dyslexic people didn't realize they were dyslexic. And so one of the initiatives that we started at that time was a screening program. And we eventually moved that out of the nonprofit because it wasn't really possible to get money to fund a software company inside of a nonprofit structure very easily. So we set that up as a separate company, and that became NeuroLearning. And so we've been offering a screener for use by people since 2019, and that's something that we've been doing there. So.
But it's machine learning, and it has like data points for people, because you have things like, well, we're screening dyslexia in the schools, and it'll have like dibbles or something like that, right?
Yeah, and well, it's based on the same sort of principles that we talked about before, where we recognize dyslexia as a spectrum. It's a syndrome condition that's created by a number of different processing factors, and the interventions for different people with dyslexia are going to be a little bit different depending on which contributing factors they have. So we really try to isolate the contributing components and then figure out how to tie that in with interventions. So I think that's what separates what we do from.
So it includes things like auditory processing, visual processing, working memory. I mean, a lot of these kind of things. And in fact, I mean, it's been able to. It is not a diagnostic, but it has helped students, for instance, qualify for 504s, and even in some cases, adult licensing accommodations. It often has to be presented with other information by clinicians who know them, but it's another piece of information usually when applying for accommodations when you've got this atypical route. For instance, we know of a physician who was going for specialty boards and wanted more time to read, and this little screener was able to help qualify them for the extra time that they needed to read the questions. So there are these kind of things. It's just meant to help people in a practical way, but not necessarily have to do, an examination, which otherwise might cost $5,000 or $6,000. So
I'm wondering along the way, with your journey with dyslexia, if there's anything in your discoveries that has been surprising to you, or perhaps that you think would be surprising to the general public. Could be both.
I think, well, the one that comes to mind is, I mean, this is now years ago, but it was, well, there's a couple of surprises, but one that comes to mind is just that you could identify someone might be dyslexic just by looking at their strengths. I think that was kind of, initially, I think we were wondering, and then we saw that more and more, and that was kind of interesting to us. And the other big surprise scientifically that comes to mind is that in the first book, we came up with the MIND acronym based on this survey, but it was only by the second book we realized that the science kept pointing to the default mode network as the source of this, and it tied together the mind strengths. So that was really kind of cool. And then there have been a handful of papers actually looking at, because it's not reading, so there's a lot of funding for the phonological aspects of dyslexia, but there's less funding for this other aspect of it, even though, like we've mentioned, has a lot of ramifications. But that part for the update was really fascinating to us because then it gave us an opportunity to look into default mode network and precuneus, for instance, where there's a lot of imagery, and how dyslexia was connected to that side. Not looking, I mean, there's an importance of recognizing that some of the left hemispheric connections make it difficult to fluently read, but also important to recognize, the more extensive network in the right hemisphere and kind of plumb the strengths that are over there to understand that in kind of a balanced way.
Yeah. Let's talk about the your new film, which we watched. It's I think a really great, accessible in a different medium exposure to the ideas that you talk about in the book. But can you tell us a little bit about the film and your hopes for it?
We love it. I love it. I just love it. I love it so much. And I think a lot of what I love about it is that I've seen a lot of films on dyslexia, and I've heard a lot of stories in media about dyslexia. And for me, it was just so wonderful to, to just spend some time in film with some wonderful dyslexic people in their natural habitat, doing things they love to do. And it's such a contrast to focusing only on second or third graders or sometimes fourth graders in the classroom. And I think I love how much the people are cast shared about their personal journeys and also shared about how they found their niche. I love so many aspects of it, and I'm totally grateful to all the people who contribute to the film because they're amazing people. I've connected them with other young people. They're wonderful mentors, and I think I would love to see more time spent with adult dyslexics, just sharing, their path and also their instruments of success. I just think there's a lot the world needs to learn about that. So I found it wonderful. You want to add something to that?
No, I think I think it reflects really well what we found when we started holding conferences for adult dyslexics, which is that there's this incredible commonality of experience that people in the community share that comes from going through this long period early in life where you're just fundamentally misunderstood and undervalued in many cases, and where in a lot of cases expectations are just very, very low for you in your future. And then just showing what people look like when they reach a time where they no longer need to be defined and held back by the things that are challenging for them, but where they can really focus on the things that they do well and how differently it looks. I think, one of the things that became really obvious to us early on when we started working with families is that teachers who work with dyslexic kids just have no idea what these kids can look like in 30 years, or 20 years. And they see the second or third grade child that literally just cannot spell cat or read a single word. And they think that, this kid is going to just grow up and be a failure, or they're going to be packing groceries or whatever. And then, 30 years later, they own the grocery store chain, and it's just letting people know that what they're looking at when they're looking at a young child who's just struggling in a really dramatic way with things that so many of the classmates are doing easily, they may be looking at a child who is, a future, physicist or a future entrepreneur or a future artist, and that those struggles do not have a thing to do with that child's intelligence or with their capacity or with their capability. And just recognizing they're dealing with a really local phenomenon, not a general phenomenon that describes that child's entire cognitive potential. And there are implications that come from that understanding that will, should impact the entire organization of our educational system and educational philosophy that really haven't penetrated yet. But it's really important that teachers understand that when they're looking at these kids that are really struggling, that those kids may eventually grow up and have a fantastic future ahead of them. We've had so many people that we've worked with that have been told along the ways, oh, you're
not college material.
You're not college material. You're not the kind of person that could become, X or
you can't do this. You can't be a space scientist.
Yeah,
you can't be
adjust your goals, adjust your expectations.
Yeah, and it's so incredibly off, And so the more and part of the difficulty, the intensity of that negative experience when you're young, makes people not want to talk about it. And as a result, I mean, we have seen so much of a stronger sense of people talking about their adult experiences and also reflecting their childhood. But I think that helped with their book, and I think the more that comes out, then it'll help that other generation because it's really empowering. And there's, a lot of just amazing, surprising people who are dyslexic, and it's like the Steven Spielbergs who took, it took him years to actually come out, more significantly. I think they waited on his interview for years, is what I heard, and there are a lot of people like that, but thankfully so, because I think it really helps the whole community. The more people who are willing to talk about it, even though it could be a source of embarrassment or shame early on, it's not. It's a source of empowerment and excitement and beauty. So,
I mean, one thing we definitely do not want to underplay is that these people were all strong enough to make it through very difficult situations with their belief in themselves intact and with their ability to keep trying intact. And they're exceptional in that way. And there are a lot of people who have been defeated and have stopped trying. And this is not a film about those people. It's a film about the potential of those people, given the right environment, to become the people that we show in the film. And there are many, many, many people that are being defeated by this constant experience of being put in situations where they don't understand why they're struggling and other people aren't, and where they begin to internalize the negative messages. And the film is really to encourage people to recognize that we are losing a lot of people along the way, and we need to rethink our systems. There's all this information trotted around all the time with studies that look at, if we don't teach the kids to read well by fourth grade, half of them are going to end up, with these horrible outcomes and whatever, as if that was a study about dyslexia. That's not. That's a study about our educational system. And it's not interpreted that way. It's interpreted as if it's saying something about those people. It's not. It's saying something about us. It's saying something about the fact that we don't know how to cultivate the potential of people who learn to read along a different time frame, and we don't provide them with the educational options they need after fourth grade to develop into the kind of people that we show in the film. And so if we can really just break some of these stereotypes, some of these really narrow tracks that characterize thinking in this field about what it means to be a person with a dyslexic kind of mind, then that's, we'll have achieved the goal that we really set out for.
Yeah, that's such a helpful way to discuss it, helpful framework. So as we wrap up, and you've been doing some of this already with particularly that advice to teachers, we're just curious if you had any, final words of wisdom or advice, perhaps for a dyslexic kid or their parents or the general public.
watch the film.
Yeah.
And we'll link to the
Yes.
film in the
Oh
notes.
yeah, we're at dyslexicadvantage.movie is but we've also now put that dyslexiavantage.org. We also have a library for parents and teachers and tutors at dyslexiavantage.org. But yeah, I think it's a good. We recently spoke to a mom who was just saying that she had listened to the book, but the movie helped her peg a lot of the ideas because then it was set with more pictures and the animations and things like that. And I think it could be a helpful way. I mean, I heard I guess I heard from her grandmother too, who was watching with her grandson and her husband, just talking about how there might be some practical strategies that they could do because they were helping them, with schoolwork and I think we wanted to help on a lot of different angles. It's not simply a feel good movie. I'd like it to be a feel good, but it's not just that, actually. I do think a lot of people have told us that understanding themselves was really the key for a lot of success later. And part of this is just an introduction to understanding yourself and understanding the advantages that come with your particular set of thinking.
Yeah, I would, I think the one message that I'm trying to get across the most right now, just in terms of this, know yourself kind of thing, is understanding what you can do with a mind that's geared to learn through experience and through imagination as opposed to through rote. And to to if you can really start to understand how multi-purpose a tool, a good personal memory, a good episodic memory, a good memory for experience is, and what you can do with that to learn in an imaginative way, in a way where you learn to create stories for yourself or pictures for yourself or acting things out for yourself or come up with rhymes or songs or raps or whatever. It's going to be different for different people, again, with that modular brain, what you plug it into, but it's going to be some form of experience as opposed to just drill, 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 drill. And getting people to really understand what a mind like that is good for, how putting yourself imaginatively in a historical situation is the best way to understand history for a mind like that, as opposed to reading a bunch of facts, or getting in conversations with people as opposed to just reading things. Those are the kinds of self-understanding that are going to unlock school and unlock learning for dyslexic kids. It's not just all about reading. It's,
Right. Yeah, that's easy for people to think at the start, because often when people find out about dyslexia, it is because of reading, right? But it's not just about reading.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on Dyslexia Journey. We highly recommend both the book and the movie. We really appreciate all the work that you have done and continue to do around this area. This was a very important book for us when we discovered it a few years back, and as part of our journey with our daughter's dyslexia. And so we really appreciate you spending this time and sharing this with our audience.
Well, thanks very much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.